Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. Hello, today I'm joined by Angela Buckley, a Victorian crime historian and author of the website Victorian Supersleuth, which I will link in the notes. Hi Angela, nice to see you today.
Hi Natalie, lovely to be here.
Thank you. As always, I thought I'd get started by asking you about your own family history. So can I ask you what started you in tracing your own family history?
Yeah, well, I'm actually from Manchester, so most of my roots, what I thought were around Manchester, but of course, with it being an industrial city, everybody came from all over the place. So in fact, my roots don't go that deep into the city, although they go reasonably deep. And I also have Italian ancestry, so my Italian ancestors came to Manchester in the mid sort of 19th century. So that's all I kind of really knew about that. My dad was born next door to where I was born in Manchester, so I knew we were local, if you see what I mean. But his father, my granddad, who we lived with when we were growing up, I knew that he was from Wiltshire, and that he migrated into the city. So it wasn't really until he died and they left something in the 80s and left some things in his possessions. So there was quite an intriguing letter and newspaper article about his sisters who'd all migrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And so I kind of parked it for a while and then and was busy with life and working and stuff and studying. And then when the 1901 census was published online, that was the thing that got me into it. And I looked up my granddad. And so I had known him, he died at aged 86 in 1986. So I'd known him as what I thought was an old man, essentially, when we lived, as we were growing up. And to find him on the 1901 census in Wiltshire, as a 6-month-old baby with all the sisters listed, the ones that all emigrated, that was what really, I thought, wow, this is really amazing. And that was what kickstarted my interest in family history.
I can really relate to that because I started tracing my own family history. Well, my mum was the one that got me into it, and she had already been tracing hers long before the internet. Done a bit and then got stuck basically. And then around the time that the 1901 census came out, somebody gave me a book. I was 18, and then that was it. We were totally hooked, and we did it together all the time. So that I think that was probably quite a big turning point for a lot of people, that 1901 census.
You can almost remember the moment, can't you? I can almost remember that, seeing that. Maybe, I don't know, was that the first one that was available? I don't know. Or was it just because it was released online? I don't know.
I'm not sure. I can't remember because I can't remember. But yeah, it was exciting.
Really exciting.
And do you have any favourite ancestors? Any that you've enjoyed tracing in particular?
Well, in fact, that line to America has been the most fascinating line. So basically, I have 4 generations who emigrated to America, and each time we were left behind in England. So I could have been American, which is interesting, following the elections to see my ancestral states. And basically, eventually, when I researched that properly, what I discovered was that my 3 times great-grandmother, Anne Nottage, was widowed when she was 50 or 52. And she was illiterate, she was a charwoman, and she lived in a labouring community in Hertfordshire. And she basically upped sticks and moved to the States. And she she had 8 children. She took 5 of them went to the States, all adults by this stage, and they had the most extraordinary adventures there. They one of them fought in the Civil War. They opened businesses. One of them opened a business that later was famous for Red Sox. They bought property. There was a sheriff. There was a county coroner. The most extraordinary experiences. There was a link with Buffalo Bill, and she herself, she basically spent 10 years crossing the landmass to the Midwest, out to the west, and she settled in Wyoming, and she was an early pioneer of one of the cities in Laramie in Wyoming. So it's an extraordinary story for just a working woman.
Really extraordinary.
No education, and that particular story never ceases to inspire me. I'm still researching it because there's so many angles, so many links. They did Gold Rush, they did all sorts of links with American history. They were in all the fraternities, the Masons, the whole lot, and that's probably the branch that I enjoy exploring the most.
Do you find I don't know about you, but when things go wrong sometimes in life, and little hiccups happen, I quite often find myself thinking about, in particular, my great grandmother, and thinking, well, she just had to get on with it, so I'm just going to have to pull my socks up. Do you kind of have that similar emotional response to somebody that's done amazing, quite inspiring things for their generation?
I absolutely do. Yeah, I really do. I think it's really inspiring. And every one of her family did something. The opportunities that she gave them they all went together, because I say they were all adults. But for her to travel, I just think that's amazing. We often make excuses, don't we, for ourselves sometimes, think, oh, I can't do that, or I can't do that for whatever reason. But when you think of, somebody just doing that kind of thing and leaving their country, and she had a better life over there. And, obviously my family were very poor. But at least she took the opportunity. And my own ancestor got left behind, and he went to London and became a policeman, actually, in the Met.
Okay.
So he's got quite an interesting story. And it comes right down to the present day, when my granddad's sisters all left because their father died when they were young, and they all left to join family members over in the States. And he got left behind, and I did meet them, actually. Well, the kids, one branch went to Canada, and I did meet them a few years ago. We had a reunion, and it was the most extraordinary experience. 100 years since my grandfather and their grandmother had been in touch, and we got in touch through Ancestry, and we've been corresponding, and we've now met 3 times. And I went over in 2016 for a sort of celebration, because it's my 50th birthday, and that's what I wanted to do. And we have a very small family here, and I had a meeting, like a lunch, with 50 members of my blood relatives.
Wow.
From family, and it was one of the most special days that I've had. So those
I bet gave you goosebumps, actually.
Yeah, and I can't wait to go back when I'm stuck here and they're stuck there.
Could you see family resemblances when you met up with these more distant cousins?
Yeah, so my main cousin, she's a second cousin, Mary. We have so many connections, and in fact, I met her mother. Her mother is still alive, and well, in fact, at the time, 3 of that generation were alive, and they're my dad's first cousins, but they're much older than my dad, and they could remember coming over, meeting my grandparents, and that sort of thing. And yeah, there's lots of similarities particularly between me and Mary. We connected immediately on Ancestry, and we have a regular correspondence. And she's been here twice. I've been there. It's
that's lovely.
I go when the restrictions lift. I'll be heading off to Canada to visit family. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely. I write to a third cousin of mine that I met via Ancestry that shares my on my Pither side, and we quite often swap research and things. Like, I've never met them. I've always wanted to. I've always thought it'd be really lovely to meet up. But yeah, I have to do it one day.
I can recommend it. Yeah, it was the most amazing day.
So you mentioned one of your ancestors there was in the Met. Was that your grandfather, did you say?
It was actually my great-great-grandfather. Yeah.
Is that what started your interest in crime history, or were you already doing that at that point? Or
yeah, it wasn't really him, actually. He came along later. So going back to my granddad's family that were in Wiltshire, the first thing I did, because I live in Berkshire, so it's just obviously a hop into the next county. The first thing I did before everything really was digitized, I went to the the Wiltshire and Swindon History Centre, it wasn't before, the archives anyway, in Trowbridge, to just have a look. And I had no idea what I was really looking for. It's the first time I've ever been. And I found this file that said something like the good and the bad and the ugly, or something like that on there. A kind of really intriguing, kind of title. And I thought, well, that's really weird. What's that? And I looked through, and it was a calendar of prisoners for the local prison in Devizes, and that's what I was having a look at. And I found my great uncle there, called Cornelius Willoughby, and Willoughby's my birth name, so it's quite exciting. And Cornelius Willoughby. And I got the trial records from the archive at the time, and he basically had been caught stealing potatoes from a local publican, and his stepmother had shopped him in because she'd recognised the potato peelings, and she'd gone straight back to the publican to report poor Cornelius, or Nell as he was known, and she obviously didn't like him very much, and he was banged up for 6 weeks in the local prison. And then, intriguingly, his father, so my great-great-great-grandfather, then tried to commit suicide. And I couldn't find out for ages why he tried to commit suicide, but that's the kind of slightly different story. But what intrigued me was the idea that I had an ancestor who broke the law, and it may have had an impact on his father. It didn't turn out that was the reason. Like we were saying before, things are always a bit different in real life, and that really struck me that she could chop him in, that he could be sent away for 6 weeks, and this was a really tragic family because originally there was something like 8 children, from my great grandfather's family, Thomas, and so many of them had died due to poverty. And I think the thing that struck me the most is that poverty was the key factor in my family, and they're not the only ones. As I came to investigate further, apart from one rather notorious character who didn't do it for reasons of poverty, the rest of them, many of them committed petty thefts, usually food or clothing or wood. And I think for me that was extraordinary. And I went, following that particular visit, I went to Marlborough, where that family originated from, in the villages.
I went to school in Marlborough.
Oh, did you? Well, have you been to the workhouse cemetery? There's a workhouse cemetery, and 3 generations of my family died in that workhouse. And 100 years later, I've been to university, I was so different as a, growing up 100 years later in relative wealth compared to them. That really struck me, and it was a very humbling experience. So for me, the crime was very much linked to the social experiences, the history, the kind of lifestyle that my ancestors were forced to lead in comparison to mine,
Yeah. Were you one of the first generations in your family to go to university?
I am the first person.
Me too. And I think most of my ancestors were very poor, living in Notting Hill slum areas. Very, very poor. And crime, a lot of mostly petty, but there's a lot of a pub brawl that's got a bit out of hand and things like that. But it does make you look at just how far we've come in such a short space of time. Actually, one of the reasons I was really excited to speak to you today is because the Victorian era is my absolute favourite time period ever. I love it. And I'm guessing you feel the same because you've decided to focus on the Victorian era. I wondered, before I rant on about why I love it so much, I thought I'd ask you, why Victorian? What's so great about the Victorian era?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of fell into history because I'm not a historian, so I'm a linguist, and I dropped history when I was 14 because we had to go to Manchester Museum every week and draw pictures of Egyptian artifacts, and we had a really weird teacher because I was at school in a convent, and the history teacher was particularly unusual. So I gave up. I gave up history. So I haven't got a range to draw on, to be fair, although I've always loved historical fiction. I used to read a lot about the Tudors, as all teenage girls did back then. So I kind of fell into Victorian because I think because of the records, really, and because I could access, my family history through that, that period. And I have dabbled in other centuries. But for me, I just love the contradictions in the Victorian era. I love that they're innovative and scientific, and that they're always pushing the boundaries, yet at the same time they have quite a strict moral code. There's quite a lot of oppression, there's poverty, great division between wealth and the wealthy and the poor. So I think for me it's a really complex and rich, in the true sense of the word, not in terms of wealth, period where all sorts of things are happening. I really enjoy reading about the developments during the factory acts and the changes, the sanitary acts, and how you get from a situation like, because I'm obviously from Manchester, how Manchester started out during the Industrial Revolution and how awful it was in the cramped accommodation for the poor inhabitants in the centre of the city, to how it became during that century, and how it ended up at the end. And obviously doing police history, I see more of that through that than perhaps I do through my own family history, because most of my family in the end all moved out, as people always do in the cities. So that's for me. And different environments, the rural life. I mean, as a city dweller, I don't know anything about rural life, but I've actually quite enjoyed, researching my own rural ancestors and trying to understand how difficult it would have been on the, in agriculture at that time. So immigration and emigration, both of that's affected both of my families.
I've been nodding vigorously.
Complex, isn't it? Yeah, do you agree?
No, I absolutely agree. I think I probably found the Victorian era the most easily accessible as well. I did English Lit at uni, so we did a lot of 19th century novels in particular. I always seemed to end up focusing on those, that period when we were studying. And I had a really good A-level teacher who taught us public history, and he just made it really come to life. He was just brilliant. So that helped. But I think that the thing I love about it is that so much is changing, and it almost feels to me that they really are our cousins, because they are so similar to us, and yet they are so different, you know. So I love that mix. I've got one ancestor that went from being a fishmonger to an umbrella maker, and I think that just kind of sums up the Victorian period. They're innovative and inventing and reinventing themselves, and yet they have such, you know, some really strict social moral codes, and yet they're bending those. I love it. I could wax lyrical all day. So in terms of policing, for anyone who's not familiar, what was Victorian policing like? Was it in its infancy, or had it been quite developed by that stage?
Well, it was quite parochial. It was parochial before the early sort of 19th century. So in your community, whatever that kind of community was, whether it's a rural parish or a town, you know, a more urban township, it was managed locally. So it was a complex mix of a parish constable, maybe, who was not paid. It was a volunteer who was selected, you know, for a year, if you're in a rural place, you know, who would go out and just try and keep the peace. In the cities or the big towns, they had a complex mix of different types of policing, which was usually the combination of a day watch, a night watch, and then some sort of authority police. So in Manchester, for example, we had what was called a court elite, and they elected some police constables, but no real overriding system at all. Okay. And then in the 1820s, you start to get a push for, I won't go on about this too long, but you start to get in the 1820s for more formal policing, because people are worried about crime, really, and crime usually in terms of property theft. And also because all the people are in charge are all property owners, essentially, and also public unrest. So, you know, we want to keep the working classes firmly where they ought to be. And of course, you get the Met in 1829, but it wasn't the first police force. It was the first formal and official police force, but there were prototype police forces throughout the 1820s in different parts of the country, notably in Cheshire. And some of these were from Robert Peel. They weren't separate from that. Okay. So, but then you get a system. Basically, you get a system of 4 police forces or types of police forces, which runs all the way till the 1960s and 70s. Wow. Okay. So really the whole thing. So you've got the Metropolitan Police in London, who are directly accountable to the Home Secretary. You have another police force in London, the City of London Police, which is accountable to a different organisation and still is today. And then you get county police forces and borough police forces, and these start to come into place through a series of acts, starting in 1835 with the Municipal Corporations Act, when the town councils are set up, and then you followed by other acts in the 1850s until roughly around the middle of the century. All communities are required to have a police force which is paid and sort of quasi-professional at that point. Okay. And these systems aren't joined up, and in fact they're not really joined up today, because you only get chief constables outside of the Met and the City of London Police. They're not accountable to the Home Secretary as such, not directly. I mean, we've got police commissioners now, which is quite interesting, because we had police commissioners 150 years ago, and then they were superseded by your local council. So it's a very piecemeal system until you had amalgamation in the 1960s and 70s, which brought some greater coordination. It's a complex. Policing is very complex in the UK even today, and there are constant calls to have it changed. And there've been calls since the 19th century, and it still hasn't been become not nationalised.
Yeah, I had no idea. So it's quite interesting how looking at just goes to show how important history is, because you don't know that until you start looking into how it came to be. It explains how it is today. So how would police decide which crimes to investigate? Would they decide which crimes to investigate, or were they told where to go and what to do? Or how did that actual policing work?
Well, it was quite complex because you also get the rise of the detective police, and I'm doing a PhD in exactly that at the moment, looking at, as you say, looking at how the detective police developed their skills in investigation, and also looking at the impact of different influences on that. It was a combination of things, really. I mean, obviously, the police were very much concerned, or the authorities. So in the cities, for example, so in Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham, which are the ones that I'm studying, they had watch committees, and the watch committee was a subcommittee of the town council, and they controlled the police. They had something similar in the counties. It just depended on where you were. So that was the watch committee, or the local authorities, which directed the police mostly to what to investigate. And of course, depending on the crime in the area, so it would be things like theft, burglary, robberies, assault, drunkenness, vagrancy. These are all the kind of things that most of the time the police were dealing with, brawls, you know, that kind of thing, keeping the peace. At the same time, you do get national intervention. So if there was a rise, so for example, in the 1860s, there's a rise in garrotting, particularly nasty crime. So the police are, you know, effectively have to start investigating that. Later in the century, you get the baby farms, which I've also researched, you know, so they start to investigate that, and infanticide. So there's a combination of different things, but basically anybody could affect that. So in the early part of the 19th century, ordinary people wrote into the police all the time to try and get them to investigate things. You know, the equivalent of social media was very much alive and kicking. The newspapers would be, you know, trying to influence the police. Agencies, private agencies might be trying to employ the police for different things. Businesses could employ the police privately. So it was a whole range of things. And it was quite difficult for the police to deploy their officers properly, because they were pulled in all different directions, which probably is no different than it is today.
So what happened when a really, really serious crime happened, like a murder or murder, something, you know, sort of the worst type of crimes? Would that generate a kind of automatic response almost, or would it still require somebody to say, you know, you've got to go and look into this crime?
Yeah, well, the truth is we don't really know, and that's partly why I'm researching it. Murder is one of the chapters in my thesis is looking at that. And I've been in the National Archives reading endless murder depositions from Lancashire and Warwickshire to try and tie that into the detective police. And there was no formal approach, I would say, at that time. There weren't that many murders. I mean, we do tend to think of it as a big crime. And of course, it was a serious crime, but it was low incidence. Murder was relatively rare compared to other crimes. And it would really depend at a local level on what was going on. So quite often I found that murders were investigated by police constables, uniformed police. And then sometimes it was transferred to the detective department, so to the plainclothes officers, and they tended to examine the crime scenes. But in the depositions that I've read, and I've read quite a lot of them so far, often there was no investigation needed, because often, sadly, it was cases of domestic violence, probably more often than not. So the drunken man would still be in the bedroom, you know, that kind of thing, or somebody would know who it was, or if it was a brawl in the street, local people would have been involved, they would have known who it was. So there wasn't a great deal of investigation needed. Obviously, increasingly throughout the century, you need more evidence, because the criminal justice system is also evolving. It's like the Victorians, everything is evolving. So more evidence is needed, but no, I wouldn't say that there was no protocol as such. For the complex crimes like Whitechapel, that's a whole different kind of issue, but that's rare, isn't it? You know, the Whitechapel situation. And what the Whitechapel situation in 1888 shows us is that there was no coordination between the police, even at that late stage in the century.
Yeah, which is quite late, really, when you think about it. When you think how long, you know, people have been committing crimes since the dawn of time. It's interesting, actually, because I have an ancestor that was that got found not guilty of manslaughter, but I say got off because I think he was lucky. He basically went into a pub and tried to start a fight, and I suspect it was for money. I think he was trying to get people to bet on him that he would win the fight against another chap who didn't really want to have a fight, but basically got so annoyed with him insisting that he fight him that he did. So they went outside the pub to have a boxing match. They had seconds, and my ancestor hit this man, and he fell and cracked his head on a curb, and never woke up, you know, and he died. it went to court, and it looked like it was going to go against my ancestor Thomas, and right at the last minute the landlord basically gave evidence and said, look, this guy is horrible and he's a drunk and he's not a very nice person, but actually I did watch it, and it was an accident, you know, it wasn't he hit his head as he stumbled, but it wasn't from the punch, so he kind of got off. But interestingly, the judge said, I've got to find him not guilty because the police have botched the investigation. The witness statements have not been taken properly, and it wasn't coordinated. And then when I looked into it, one of the key witnesses was actually married to like the cousin of the person that died. And so you had all these other factors of people that, you know, may not have been telling the truth in the witness stand. So it was really interesting to see that play out, really. And I can totally relate to what you're saying about the police not being coordinated at that time. That kind of makes sense from my own small family history findings.
Fascinating. And there are lots of instances like that in the records, you know, certainly for the cities, you know, the brawls that got out of hand, you know, and it must have been very difficult, mustn't it, to really try and work out exactly what happened. And you read these very conflicting testimonies, don't you, that he said, she said, you know, they said. It's quite difficult, I think.
And like with boxing being a really popular sport as well, and that kind of taking it outside to have a fight for fun, for money,
illegal boxing as well.
So
legal betting.
Which it would have been illegal betting, so you can sort of see how that could escalate. So I was going to ask, let's just throw me for a sec there. I was going to ask what tools did the police have at their disposal to investigate crime? How did they go about proving or disproving somebody's guilt or innocence?
Well, this is another aspect of my thesis, actually. Very few, I would say. I mean, they mostly relied on their, as far as I can tell so far, on their innate characteristics of, you know, typically, you know, being observant, you know, using their common sense and basically being fairly determined to, you know, bring about a conviction. I mean, it was mostly built on witness testimonies, I would say. Very little evidence. I mean, they did collect evidence from crime scenes, like, you know, what I love is they always produce them in court. So I always say there's always a bloodied axe, you know, in the court, because they used to take the evidence away and then they bring it back, you know, now produced, and they would bring the bloodied clothing. And in fact, I was in the archives, not recently, obviously, but when I was last in the archives in January, I was looking at something completely different, and I opened the box, as you do. And at the bottom of the box, I found a case that I wasn't at all interested in, but they had lots of little white envelopes in. And I thought, this is very intriguing. What's this? And I opened the little tiny white envelopes, and it was bloodied clothing.
Oh my God, and it survived.
In case, just buried in the bottom of a, you know, in a random box. So, you know, one of the things why we love, you know, doing this kind of investigative work. So they didn't have much beyond that, really. It was mostly, they didn't have any science until the end of the century. And even then, I haven't yet found any proof that they used it in the big cities outside of London. I think that's going to come in at the beginning of the 20th century. I haven't found a case yet where they used a fingerprint.
I was just going to say, did they use
fingerprint? Not yet. What I have found noticed is increasingly towards the end of the 19th century, they're using sketches. So they're using plans of houses and outdoor areas to show where the crime scene was and where the victim might have walked, that kind of thing. I'm seeing much more of that. I haven't found any photos yet, but I've found evidence of plaster casts. I haven't seen them for real. So where they've done a plaster cast of the victim's skull, for example. As I say, no physical evidence, just a reference to it. And more sort of sketches and plans, so that I can see them professionalizing, which is what I'm looking for, towards the end of the 19th century, and starting to build external evidence. They have more use of experts. Having said that, I found examples in the mid-century, particularly in poison cases, which is a whole other area, where they have, you know, collected samples from the scene, and they have sealed them and put them in a cupboard. As opposed to just taking them home, and they have had them analysed by an expert chemist. So it's piecemeal. I mean, as you know, history isn't linear. So what I'm looking for are those bits of evidence, and so there's some, I would say, some limited use of forensic tools and evidence collection.
So is there any crimes that, are there any crimes that you think are probably more prevalent in Victorian times than they are nowadays? And if so, why? You know, for example, stealing clothes. I seem to have loads of ancestors who stole handkerchiefs. And I just wonder whether you could tell us a bit about why that is.
Yeah, theft was the biggest, was the most prevalent crime, certainly in the Victorian period, and it is mostly of clothing and food, and it is down to poverty. You know, you think about the fact that probably most people only had one set of clothing, and if that, so they were always trying to steal things, clothing maybe to wear or to sell on, certainly in the cities. And I think the black market was obviously buzzing continuously. I think that's the greatest theft, and we don't see as much of that now. But then we have different types of theft for money, don't we? Kind of scamming. And scamming is a really interesting one, actually, because that's always been prevalent. So there have always been scams of all kinds of, all sorts of ingenious methods. And another thing I love about the Victorians, are so ingenious. So a multiplicity of scams and frauds throughout the 19th century, from using coins cleverly to sort of scam shopkeepers to, dropping a fake gold ring or betting scams or really complex business scams where there's one called the long firm fraud, where you would set up a bogus business and you'd order in all your things for your business, whether it's linen or printing or whatever you're doing, and then you send out orders to get orders in from people, and basically the whole thing would be a scam, and so nobody would be, all the stuff that was ordered would be sold on, and all the money that had come in for the business would just be taken. They were massive in the 19th century. White collar crime was huge.
It's amazing they haven't made like a BBC series of that Hustle.
Yeah.
But Victorian Hustle, that would be a great, if anyone's watching from the BBC.
From one single operator, on the corner of a street in Manchester, to these massive scams and, insurance scams and inheritance scams, all the kind of things, fake air hunters, loads of those.
Wow.
All sorts of things. Fake marriage bureaus and, immigration bureaus, all sorts of things I come across, particularly, in Manchester. Glorious home city, only because I've been studying that city particularly. But yes, the imagination and the ingenuity was probably even better than it is today.
Yeah. It's just going back to the theft of clothes. It just occurred to me, obviously, whilst we were talking, that obviously clothes back then took much longer and cost more to make as well. It's not like they had Primark on the corner and clothes weren't disposable in the way that they are today. And I think sometimes when you're reading these crimes, it can seem quite petty that somebody's been punished for stealing a shirt, but then when you think about how much a shirt might have cost or how much time and effort went into making a shirt, it starts to make a bit more sense. And
I think that's true even till more recently. My dad is a bit of a hoarder and has all sorts of stuff in his cellar, and he found a box of receipts, bizarrely, from our school uniform, which is the 1970s, and it was really expensive because there was no Tesco, so we didn't have a school uniform when we were at primary school, but in secondary school, had a school uniform, and it was the blazers. It was extraordinarily and this isn't a private school, this is a regular school. It was really expensive,
Yeah, it's really funny you say that, because I was talking to my mum the other day about school uniform costs and moaning, and she said, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," because she was telling me that she put my school uniform on a store card because at the time they were short for money, and it took her over 6 years to pay off.
Unbelievable.
2 years worth of school uniforms, because they were so expensive, because they weren't in the supermarket then on Matalan and Primark and those kind of shops.
No, nothing online, obviously.
One set provider.
Exactly.
You're right, even in recent times those kind of things change quite rapidly. So if you were a Victorian criminal, unfortunately, or you got caught committing a crime, what kind of punishment might you face? What were the kind of ranges of punishment?
Well, obviously it does depend, and I think we tend to sometimes focus on the kind of bloody code at the beginning of the 19th century, where you could be hanged for stealing a sheep, which of course was true at the time, but that was rapidly dismantled in the 1830s and was not true for most of the Victorian period. Now, my own ancestors who committed, going back to the family history, committed crime, mostly got fines. I would say, which, you know, often ended up putting them into the workhouse. So although it doesn't look like much money to us, it was still quite a significant amount of money. In terms of more serious crimes, obviously there were custodial sentences. There were nowhere near as many executions as we led to believe, and there were actually very few, and there was often a push to avoid a death sentence. And so people might be tried on a smaller, a lower, lesser charge like manslaughter in order to avoid a death sentence. So there weren't as many of that kind of thing, and often they were commuted anyway. When it's always important to check whether somebody was actually executed, because more often than not, it was commuted to life imprisonment. And so imprisonment with hard labour was the main punishment, I would say, for more serious crime. And of course, also running through that, you've got transportation, which has gone by the 1850s/60s.
Okay.
It's repealed I think it was repealed in 1853, something around that, and it takes another 10 years for that to play out. So again, it's a relatively small period when people were transported to the penal colonies from the late 18th century, but then America pulls out and they go to Australia. So it's not quite as rife as it would seem. I can't remember what the figures are off the top of my head for the number, but it's hundreds of thousands, isn't it? People are, but again, that's not so typical. So I think really probably the most typical punishments will be a fine or a period of confinement, which could be anything from a few days to, you know, life. I guess that probably runs through. And as I said before, you know, the criminal justice system is evolving. The penal system is evolving throughout that period as well. So, you know, that has an impact on sentencing.
Sure. I've got quite a few ancestors that were given a choice of fine or imprisonment, or if you didn't pay the fine on time, you obviously got imprisonment. But sometimes it was I say choice, it's written in the papers as, you know, fine of X shillings or 6 weeks hard labour, and sometimes you'll actually see them saying, I'll take the hard labour, you know.
Yes, that's interesting.
Which I always think is quite poignant. That actually your wealth when you commit a crime, even that determines how you're treated. Did it make any difference when you went to prison how you were treated? Were different prisoners treated in different ways, or by the Victorian period had jail and prison become quite standard? Or
yeah, you got these super prisons from the beginning, from the 1840s, really. You get this, again, we're talking, you know, about the Victorians and their evolutions, and the penal system, there's massive evolution there. So you get the beginnings of the penal system, the modern penitentiary system. So I think it starts with Pentonville. I think it was 1842 or the early 1840s, they built Pentonville prison in London, based on the American penitentiaries. And then you get this blueprint for prisons, which we still have today. You know, we still have Victorian prisons today that were built on that original blueprint from Pentonville in the 1840s. So you get a very strict regime in most of those Victorian prisons then, which of course were large institutions. You get what's called either the silent or the separate system, where prisoners were kept in solitary confinement and weren't allowed to contact, you know, very bad for mental health, but weren't allowed to make contact with other prisoners because of the fear of contamination. I think it's true to say that some prisoners, maybe high profile prisoners, did get some. I mean, if you look at Oscar Wilde, you know, even in 1890s, although he was subjected to quite harsh conditions here in Reading, at Reading prison, he definitely had a better, you know, he still was allowed his books and other things. So I think there was still possibly some variation. And I don't know as much about high profile. And I know a lot about high profile prisoners, but they would tend to be working class. I don't know very much about anybody who came from a higher level in society as much. And certainly all the prisoners I've investigated all were treated pretty much the same, but they were all from the lower side of society. So that's not any great surprise. But yeah, there was the hard labour was institutionalized by then, very regimented kind of day. You know, the diet was regimented, everything was regimented about prison life from the 1840s onwards.
And what sort of thing would you be doing if you were subject to hard labour? What was hard labour?
So it depended on the prison, but it could be, so in Reading here, we had the hand crank. So you'd be basically turning a hand crank for hours at a time, which in Reading actually was used to draw water, but in many prisons, it didn't have any practical purpose. It was just for a punishment. Okay. So you might be using a treadmill. So again, it was hours on the treadmill, which always sounds. I did put a picture up recently on social media of a treadmill. It's not like a treadmill, that we think of in the gym, but actually the steps were really high. It was kind of wooden, and it was exhausting. It was physically very, very difficult. You might be breaking rocks. In some of the convict prisons, they were breaking rocks in quarries. They're often building quarries or excavating quarries, or whatever you do with a quarry. Oakum picking, or there was a whole range. Shot drilling. There was a whole way you'd move kind of big kind of cannonballs from one place to another. There was a whole range of punishments that prisons could use, and they employed whichever ones they wanted to use. And basically the purpose was monotony and arduous labor, to make your life pretty difficult.
It's really interesting that you mention oakum picking there as well, because I know that's something that the inmates were asked to do in the workhouse, and yes. it just starts that those blurred, aren't they? The work just again emphasizes just how difficult life was if you were poor. And I was going to ask something then, it's just popped out my head, it will come back, hang on. I'm doing about stones. What was it? I'll cut this bit. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Am I right in thinking, well, two things. Am I right in thinking that it was the Victorians that brought in the panoptic eye? So the tower in the middle of the prison where you could see everybody, and so that in itself became a punishment because you had no privacy. There was always the eye on you.
Yeah, it was a sort of panopticon, and that was the blueprint of those Victorian prisons. So you'd have the central tower with the governor in, or the warders, and then you'd have it like a wheels of a spoke, everything arranged round so that you could they could keep their beady eye on what was going on. Absolutely, yeah. Okay.
And am I also right as well in thinking that you had separate debtors' prisons? Like I'm thinking Marshalsea in London. I'm thinking of Little Dorrit and
there's a whole range of prisons, and I've kind of mostly focused on the kind of main institutions. But yes, the debtors' prison. I was looking at that recently actually, because I was looking for an ancestor who got married in the debtors' prison. But I discovered that in fact it didn't necessarily mean that he was in the debtors' prison, because they were running a bit of a marriage racket, I think, around the area in Marshalsea, doing kind of cheap weddings because of some act, parliamentary act, which they were trying to get around something or other. Anyway, I haven't quite fully looked into that. Yeah, that was kind of a bit weird, but yeah, so there were different prisons as well for different types of things. I don't know as much about the debtors' prisons, but yes, they were certainly in existence. I'm not sure when they disappeared.
So with all the work you've done on looking at sort of individual crimes, is there any particular crime that has or case rather that's that you've not been able to put down, that's really fascinated you, or really kept your interest?
I've done a lot of work obviously with the Manchester Police, and there are a number of cases which I quite enjoy kind of going back to there. I think one of the most interesting cases, and I think it's down to individuals actually, and I think coming back to family history, I think it's the individuals that fascinate you. For me personally, I think there are several things that fascinate me about crime history. Not so much the blood, guts, and gore, but for me, it's about the police and how they investigated things, and the individuals. And more recently, I've been quite interested in looking at victims of crime, which I haven't perhaps looked at so much in the past. I've tended to look at perpetrators of crime, whereas actually the victims of crime are all very interesting as well, aren't they? And how they, what happened to them if they survived, and what was the impact on their lives. And I keep going back to the baby farming quite often, because I wrote a small book on Amelia Dyer, the notorious Victorian baby farmer who was arrested here in Reading. And actually, mostly I focused on her as the perpetrator, because there's lots of mystique around her. Why did she commit those crimes? How many babies did she kill? Could have been hundreds. How did she get away with it for so long? All that's very interesting, but there's very little we know about her. But actually, more recently, I've been looking at trying to piece together, the victims, and who were these women who gave their babies over to a woman like Amelia Dyer, and what happened to them afterwards, because they weren't killed. Their babies, unfortunately, were murdered, but they carried on. And I keep going back to that crime in a different sort of way, and looking at infanticide and looking at motherhood in a way. And, you know, there's quite a lot of, I've been looking at other baby farming cases, and there's lots of discussion about, you know, were these cases of neglect, and what's the best way to, you know, bring up a baby or feed a baby at the time. You know, again, we're back to the Victorians and what they were sort of looking at the time. And so I think, to me, the social history is really important, and certainly the baby farming, although it's not my favorite crime, in the sense I do actually find it quite unpleasant and sinister, and not something I particularly enjoy talking or writing about. But it is a window into society, and I think, and I keep going back to that type of crime. But again, it's really trying to look at the victims.
It's interesting you say about the victims, because I think with the book The Five, that was
Yes, that's what partly inspired me.
Yeah, I read that, and it made me realize just how much, like, even when I had written my own, I had an ancestor that committed suicide, and at the time the papers linked it to the Whitechapel murders. They said that she'd had a fright in London at the time. And it made me realize how much even when I was writing that, I focused on Jack the Ripper, I focused on that element to it. And actually, yet again, she got lost in the story the first time I wrote it. So I went back and re-looked at it after reading The Five. So I think it's quite an influential book, actually. And I
agree. And I have a notorious ancestor in Manchester who I always enjoy writing about, who's a brothel keeper. And I've dined out on him many times. He was a pretty sinister kind of Dickensian kind of character. But I never looked at the actual prostitutes who lived in his house, you know, and I've since been back and tried to find out more about the sad women that worked for him. I haven't been able to find out very much about them, unfortunately, but it really shocked me when I was reading The Five. I thought, gosh, I talk about, you know, my brothel keeping ancestor all the time, but I never think about the poor women that he, you know, had to do this thing, you know, to line his pockets. Not that he was very wealthy, but, you know, so I think it is really challenging to look at the victims. And in fact, you know, now when I investigate crime cases, I try and look a bit more into the victims. And in the depositions that I'm studying for my PhD, that most of them aren't actually that relevant, but I have picked out some of the stories of the victims, because obviously they're mostly coroner's reports, and so that, you know, looking into their lives, and I've started looking at the victims of those, and I think I'm going to turn it into a podcast series, because there's some extraordinary stories just from those victims who have, you know, their stories have been literally buried for 150 years. You know, they were subject to brutal crime, and then they're gone, and nobody has ever remembered them. They're not famous people by any stretch of the imagination. Nobody's written about them before. So I've become quite compelled into looking into their stories as well, and trying to find out, you know, how they came to be, or just to find out who they were. You know, who were they? You know, what were their families like? There's some really sad stories in the Liverpool papers about young boys who go off to sea in the merchant ships, and, you know, suffer fairly horrendous abuse. But the stories are quite extraordinary. You know, what was it like for a 15-year-old to go off to sea and travel? You know, one of them went to Nigeria, another one went round Latin America. What was it like for those boys? And sadly, you know, life on board was awful, and they ended up, you know, being bullied and abused. But what were, you know, can we capture something from their experience before that happened? So I've also been looking at that to, you know, I think would make an interesting podcast series.
I think it will. Yeah, let us know. No, definitely let us know when you set it up. It sounds really good. I quite often think of the descendants of those victims as well.
Yes,
you know, if they had any, and whether any of those stories had survived, because I know the few crimes that I found in my family history, you know, I have one ancestor whose son tried to shoot him, and it's not that long ago. He actually spent a year as a policeman as well. So whole another interesting story. But that story, you know, it's not that long ago. It's sort of, you know, 200 years. And yet none of that story has passed on. No, I had no idea when I was looking. No, so I think almost kind of rediscovering those victims, and then hopefully those people will do their family history and find them, and then find that they've got this rich story, and rediscover them, really. So that kind of brings me around. Actually, this is a question that I ask everybody at the end. What would you say to somebody who was thinking about tracing their family history? What would you say to them? Would you encourage them to do it?
Oh, absolutely. No, I do think it's genuinely a life-changing and life-enhancing experience. And obviously we all have our own unique experiences of family history. But I think it does set you off on a journey, which is, tremendously exciting in many ways, even though, many of us have ancestors who on the surface could appear quite dull because they were pretty poor and they didn't do anything famous. But for me, that's the fascination, the fascination lies in bringing back the voices or the people from the past whose voices have been buried for decades, isn't it, for me? I think it's full of surprises. It's frustrating, although I don't actually find it very frustrating, but it can be frustrating. But I think it's a massively exciting journey, and it's something that does inspire other people. I mean, I try not to go on about our family history in great detail to my nearest and dearest, but it does have an impact. My daughter's much more aware of her, she studies history at university. She's much more aware of her family history. She did, we have some Italian ancestors who drowned on the Andorra Star, and she's investigated that aspect because she's interested in, war and the sort of Second World War. So I think it does have an impact on, for the whole family, if you like, even though that, you have to be a bit careful going on about it in great detail. But no, I think, and I think to start quite small to a certain extent, but to keep your eyes open and just to follow the leads, follow your heart, really. I don't know about you, but you end up with loads and loads of ancestors, and most of them you ignore, and then suddenly one will grab your attention and you'll go down that rabbit hole and think, oh, that's an interesting person, maybe there's something behind that. I think you have to keep your antennae out all the time and just follow your kind of instincts with them, rather than get too bogged down in the dates, I think, and the building the tree.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I definitely have certain lines that I seem to be drawn to, and sometimes I can't even explain why, because it's not that they did anything particularly more exciting than other lines. I don't. Normally, it's because in some way I can visualize them or connect with them on a personal level, I guess.
Yes, and it still holds surprise. And I've been doing this obviously since the beginning. Since the early 2000s, and in fact that ancestor who emigrated to America, my 3 times great grandmother, I wanted to find out more about her, and I thought some of the records suggest she's from Hertfordshire, but when I delved more deeply, she came from Essex, and then I discovered that her lineage goes back in Essex to the 17th century, and my 10 times great grandparents were from Essex. I don't know anything about Essex. I'm not even sure. I think I did live there briefly once when I was a student, but that's like, so now I've got like a whole other area that I'm from Essex, which is just so exciting. So you just, it goes on, doesn't it? It's the thing, it's the gift that never stops giving.
Definitely. Have you done DNA testing yet?
I have, yeah.
Have you enjoyed it?
Yeah, I can't say I know a great deal about it, so it's quite complicated, isn't it? We've all done it. All the family members have done it, and I need to find out more about it, really. And it changes, of course, doesn't it? So obviously when they analyze it differently, it kind of, I find the changing nature of it a bit challenging.
And then with the ethnicity, you mean?
Yeah, and it hasn't thrown up any surprises, I have to say. But it has made connections with people, and it is quite comforting to know that you do have DNA, in those areas that you think of, those parts of the country or parts of, my DNA is quite European, the countries that I do think I have a link to, it's quite comforting. But yes, that's an area I need to explore. So complicated.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. No, it's been fantastic.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.